Imagine a world where you never saved your game. Not because developers forgot, but because the technology to do it almost never shipped. Every role-playing game you have ever played, every open world you have ever gotten lost in, every character you spent weeks building, all of it traces back to a single manufacturing decision made in a back room in 1986. A decision that nearly went the other way. That's not a metaphor. That's documented history. And it is just the beginning. What you are about to hear is a story about accidents. Not failures, accidents. The moments where the gaming industry as we know it wasn't built by visionaries executing a plan. It was built by manufacturing delays, engineering side projects, boardroom fights, and first-timers who didn't know what they weren't supposed to do. The industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars today was shaped repeatedly by decisions that had almost nothing to do with games. Let's start at the very foundation. The Legend of Zelda launched in 1986 in Japan, and it changed everything. It was the first major home console title to let players save their progress, to return to a world they had already explored, pick up where they left off, build on what they had done. That feature, which we now take completely for granted, is the architectural backbone of the role-playing game genre. Without it, persistent game worlds don't exist. Open-world design doesn't exist in the way we know it. Here is what almost no one knows. That save feature nearly didn't happen. According to David Sheff's book Game Over, which drew on Nintendo's internal records, battery-backed SRAM, the chip that allowed cartridges to store saved data, was considered too expensive and too unreliable for mass production. Nintendo's manufacturing partners flagged it as a risk. The cost was real. The concern about battery lifespan in a physical cartridge sitting on a shelf in a child's bedroom for years was legitimate. The feature was genuinely on the table to be cut. It wasn't cut. The manufacturing side ultimately found a path forward, costs were absorbed, and the cartridge shipped with that battery inside. But the margins were thin enough, and the internal debate serious enough, that historians of the industry treat this as a genuine fork in the road. Had the calculation gone the other way, had that chip been deemed too expensive by a single accountant, the design vocabulary of home console gaming in the late 1980s and 1990s looks fundamentally different. The games that required you to start from scratch every session don't build the same worlds. They don't demand the same depth. And a genre that took decades to develop might have taken decades longer. One manufacturing decision, one battery, one saved game. That's the foundation. But here is where it gets stranger, because the next turning point wasn't even supposed to be a feature at all. In 1993, ID Software was building Doom, the game that would define the first-person shooter, the game that would be so culturally explosive it triggered congressional hearings. If you've heard the story of Doom before, you know the basics. Small Texas studio, revolutionary 3D engine, ultra-violent content that panicked moral watchdogs across America. What the standard telling almost always leaves out is the multiplayer. Doom's networked multiplayer, the ability to connect two PCs over a local network and shoot at each other in real time, was not in the original design document. According to David Kushner's book, Masters of Doom, which is the most thoroughly sourced account of ID Software's early years, John Carmack added the IPEX network code over roughly 2 weeks, as what can only be described as a personal engineering challenge. It wasn't in the business plan, it wasn't in the pitch, it wasn't a response to market research. John Romero confirmed this context in a post-mortem talk at the Game Developers Conference in 2016. ID Software's own internal documents from 1992 contained zero mention of multiplayer as a planned feature. That 2-week side experiment became the direct ancestor of every competitive online shooter that exists today. Quake, Counter-Strike, Call of Duty. Every genre built around the concept of players competing against each other in real time over a network. Architecturally, culturally, commercially, descends from something that one engineer built because he found it technically interesting, not because anyone asked for it. The entire online shooter genre was a side project. Now consider the stakes of the next decision, because this one didn't just shape a genre, it ended a console war. In the year 2000, Sony launched the PlayStation 2 at $299 in North America. Sega's Dreamcast was already on the market. Nintendo's GameCube was approaching. On pure gaming hardware specifications, the competition was real. The PlayStation 2 was not an overwhelming technological leap over its rivals in ways that would have been obvious to a consumer standing in a store. But the PlayStation 2 played DVD mode, and in the year 2000 a standalone DVD player cost between $300 and $500. This seems obvious in retrospect. It wasn't obvious in the industry at the time. Ken Kutaragi, the Sony executive who championed the PlayStation 2's architecture, understood that the console wasn't just competing with other consoles. It was competing with every other device in a living room, and it was winning on price. Sony's own internal market research, cited in a Nikkei business interview with Kutaragi in 2001, showed that over 40% of early PlayStation 2 buyers in Japan identified DVD playback, not gaming, as their primary reason for the purchase. Think about what that means. Nearly half of the early install base wasn't primarily buying a game console. They were buying a cheap DVD player that also played games. Sega had no equivalent. The Dreamcast could not play DVDs. It had no Trojan horse, and the Dreamcast was discontinued within 16 months of the PlayStation 2 launch. The console war of that generation wasn't won on the gaming floor. It was won in the home entertainment aisle, a hardware feature that had nothing to do with games and did one of the most beloved consoles in history. But the hardware decision that arguably did the most damage, or the most good depending on how you look at it, happened inside Microsoft. The original Xbox launched in 2001, and it almost launched without a hard drive. According to Dean Takahashi's book Opening the Xbox, which reconstructed the internal decision-making process at Microsoft during the console's development, the faction pushing for a hard drive, led by engineer Seamus Blackley, nearly lost that argument as late as the summer of 2000, roughly 8 months before launch. The opposition wasn't philosophical. It was financial. A hard drive added cost to a console that was already being built at a loss. Cost-cutting executives had a legitimate case. The hard drive was approved after what Takahashi describes as a heated boardroom session, not a consensus, a fight. Now consider what that hard drive made possible. Xbox Live launched in 2002, the first unified online gaming network on a home console. It required local storage to function. Friend lists, downloadable content, game updates, account data. All of it needed somewhere to live on the box. Without the hard drive, the architecture of Xbox Live as it was built doesn't exist. The entire model of console online gaming, accounts, friends, downloadable content, patches, gets delayed. By how much, no one can say with precision. But the modern console online ecosystem, the one that every platform runs on today, required that one internal argument to go the right way. It almost didn't. Here is where the story shifts from hardware to culture, because the next accidental turning point didn't happen in a factory or a boardroom. It happened in a congressional hearing room. In December of 1993, Senator Joe Lieberman convened hearings in the United States Senate over violent video game content. The games under scrutiny included Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. The hearings were national news. The language was apocalyptic, and Lieberman made the games industry a direct offer: self-regulate within 6 months or face federal legislation. The Entertainment Software Rating Board, the ESRB, was formally established by September of 1994, 73 days of active construction. Researchers at Georgetown Law's Institute for Technology Law and Policy, in a working paper titled Rating the Raters, published in 2019, noted that no other major media ratings body in United States history was built under a comparable legislative deadline. The Motion Picture Association's rating system was developed deliberately, over years, by an industry working at its own pace. The SRB was assembled in a panic, under a political gun, by an industry that had roughly half a year to produce a functioning framework or lose control of its own content regulation. That framework, built reactively, under pressure, in less than a year, is the system that governs game content ratings today. The age categories, the content descriptors, the enforcement mechanisms. All of it was reverse engineered from a crisis, not designed from first principles. The entire regulatory architecture of the games industry was an emergency measure that became permanent. And then there is GoldenEye 007, released on the Nintendo 64 in 1997, is widely credited with establishing the template for first-person shooters on home consoles. Analog stick aiming, distinct mission objectives, headshot detection, stealth mechanics in a shooter, features that are now completely standard. That entire design language was introduced by one game. That game was made by 9 developers at Rare, most of whom had never shipped a video game before. Martin Hollis, the lead designer, had one prior professional credit, an arcade port of Killer Instinct. The core team was, by every conventional measure, unqualified for what they were building. Hollis documented this in a personal retrospective, published in 2004, and archived across multiple sources, including Edge Magazine's developer, Oral History. His description of the team's approach is telling. They invented mechanics not because they had studied the industry and identified gaps, but because they didn't know the conventions they were supposed to follow. The analog stick aiming system exists in part because nobody on the team had a strong prior attachment to how shooters had always worked. The game that taught the world how console first-person shooters should control was made by people who had never made a console first-person shooter before. That is not a motivational story. It is a structural observation about how the industry's most durable innovations sometimes come from the edges, not the center. And then there is money. The loot box, the randomized paid item mechanic that now generates an estimated $15 billion annually in the games industry, did not originate with a Western publisher. It did not come from a major studio's monetization strategy team. According to research published in the International Journal of Business Science and Applied Management by Juho Hamari and Vili Ledonvirta in 2010, the mechanic traces directly to a 2004 Korean mobile game called MapleStory, developed by Nexon, which introduced randomized paid item capsules modeled on a Japanese gachapon vending machine concept. Nexon's own annual investor reports from 2005 through 2008 documented the revenue performance of this mechanic. It was earning more per user than any subscription model in Korean gaming at the time. Western publishers studied those numbers. Nico Partners, an Asia-focused gaming market analysis firm, documented the Western industry's attention to Nexon's model in a 2013 report. The adoption wasn't immediate. It took the better part of a decade for the mechanic to migrate scale and become structurally embedded in mainstream Western titles. But the origin point is traceable and specific. A single revenue experiment in a free-to-play Korean mobile game in 2004 reshaped the global economics of game monetization within 10 years. $15 billion per year. From a gachapon machine in a Korean mobile game, the pattern across all of these stories is the same, and it is worth naming clearly. The gaming industry did not develop according to a plan. It developed according to pressure, manufacturing pressure, financial pressure, legislative pressure, competitive pressure, engineering curiosity. The decisions that redirected entire eras were not the decisions that were supposed to matter. They were the ones that almost didn't happen. A battery in a cartridge, 2 weeks of network code, a DVD drive, a boardroom fight over a hard drive, a congressional ultimatum, 9 inexperienced developers, a revenue report from Saul. Each of those moments sits at the base of something enormous. A genre, a platform, a regulatory system, a business model that affects every game being made today. And in most cases, the people in the room didn't know that. They were solving a problem in front of them. They weren't trying to build the future of anything. That is what makes this history worth paying attention to. Not because it is a series of happy accidents, but because it tells you something true about how large systems actually change. Not by design. By edges. by accidents that compound. If you find that kind of history worth understanding, the real mechanics underneath the industry, not the press releases, this channel exists to go further. Every video here is built on primary sources, documented decisions, and the questions that don't have clean answers. That's the standard, and it doesn't change.